All right. Hi, everyone. It is about 4 o'clock, and today the webinar. I would like to introduce Matt Sment, and the topic today is oh, the topic today is the fundamental of Tenkara Rod fishing. And Matt used to own the company called the Badger Tenkara. And today, Matt really enjoy teaching people, and he's very good at teaching people how to um, fish with a Tenkara rod. And Matt is based on the Midwest. Um, the next meeting will be on Wednesday with Robert Worthing, who is one of the co-founders of the Tenkara Guides, so the first Tenkara guide in the U.S. outside of Japan, or maybe in the world to be exactly. And Robert is very good at casting, and he's also good teachers, and will be um, next Wednesday. And the event will be the art of modern casting. For many of us who fish with Tenkara rods, probably know about called a level line, and it's totally different than casting with another heavy line, which more like a traditional way of fishing or conventional way of fly fishing when the line rests on the water. With the modern way of fishing, the line rarely touch the water, and it makes the fishing more fun, and it's more effective. But after all, it's a game anyway. So you can check it out. That is Matt going to present today, the fundamentals of Tenkara fishing. And also this thing will be recorded and will be on a YouTube channel, on a Tanuki fishing channel. So I would like to turn this thing over to Matt. Matt, are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. So
Okay, so technical difficulties aside, welcome to Fundamentals of Tenkara Fishing, Tenkara Rod Fishing with Matt Sment. I appreciate y'all joining us today. I'm sure that we'd probably all be out either fishing or going about our day-to-day business, but this is a good opportunity for us to slow down and polish up some skills, maybe get into a new hobby. For those of you who are just joining us, if you could do me a favor just to give me an idea how many of you in the audience are absolutely 100% new to Tenkara rod fishing. If you could just like put a, a me or something hands up there in the chat room so I can get an idea. I recognize a lot of names that I know are probably way beyond the fundamentals at this point, but I'm glad to see you all here because I think there's a lot of value to be had in revisiting the core concepts and ideas behind Tenkara rod fishing, and I'm really excited to be able to share that with you. I'm just going to check the chat real quick. Okay. Yeah, lots of new Tenkara rod anglers, so welcome. We're really excited to have you here. I think you're going to find this to be a very welcoming community, and we're really happy to have you here. And not only am I happy to answer questions, but I think you'll find that as you get to know people in the community here that they'll be happy to answer questions as well. So don't hesitate to kind of reach out and meet some of these people and hopefully join us in some of the communities online, some of the Facebook groups, maybe on Reddit, and continue to learn about Tenkara angling. So let me introduce myself. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Matt Sment. I'm the former owner of a rod company called Badger Tenkara. We were in business for about 5 or 6 years, during which the course of time I did a lot of guiding and a lot of instructing and a lot of fishing. And since then, I've also spent a decent amount of time driving around the country fishing. I spent 6 months last year living out of my van fishing the Appalachians, the Rockies, all through Colorado and Utah, the Sierras over in California. And of course, I started up in Wisconsin in the legendary Driftless area, which if you haven't heard of before today, you're going to hear that a lot in the Tenkara community. But long story short, where I'm coming from with this, and let's try to advance the, Thank you for your patience. I apologize for that little glitch there. Just so you know, I've never given a full presentation over Zoom, so this is kind of a juggling knives and torches thing for me tonight. We are going to discuss the characteristics of rods, lines, and flies. We are going to discuss the principles of gear design as it's applied to its use. For instance, why is the Tenkara rod long versus short? There's a good reason for that, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about developing a system that suits you best for the terrain and the fish that you're using. Then we're going to move on to some technique discussions, and we're going to talk about core concepts of fly and line control. And again, this is going to be perhaps a repetition for some of you more experienced anglers, but I think there's a lot of value in returning to these concepts and then being able to assess where you may be at in regards to into those fundamentals. So let's go ahead and get started. I do have move on. So first of all, before we get into all of this, let's talk about the different use cases for Tenkara rod fishing. In my view, I see a generalist use, a specialist use, and a more purist use. In the generalist use, you're going to see casual and secondary anglers. A casual angler I would describe as someone who doesn't fish all that much, may keep a rod in their car. A secondary angler would be someone who's primarily paddling or hiking or doing some other activity and bringing a rod along with them. In this generalist area, you're going to find a lot of people who will learn the basics of things and kind of go off and do their own thing, which is completely okay. There's nothing wrong with any of these different approaches, but it's important to really kind of get a good picture of them before we look at the gear. The generalist angler is really not too concerned with specifying the species of the terrain that they're fishing with. You might see that in like youth or family angling, and you don't see a lot of refinement or specific choice in regards to the gear or the techniques that are used. It is general use. And that, again, is a lot of fun. I do it myself, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with approaching your Tenkara rod fishing that way. Moving on to another approach, you have a more specialized approach, which requires more specialized gear. Flex profiles and rods that are more easier able to meet the requirements that you're looking for. You're going to see more of the enthusiasts and the focused anglers who have gotten their feet under them and gained a certain level of knowledge, and they're starting to target specific species in specific ways in specific terrain. And here's where you have something like your traditional Japanese Tenkara fly fishing coming in, where according to the definition of Tenkara fly fishing as developed in Japan, you're fishing for trout in high gradient mountain streams. Do I still have, yeah, I lost Long now, so.
No, you can hear me, you can see me. Don't worry about me.
No, sir, I can't. But anyway, so I'm kind of in the dark here. I'm just going to drive forward. Well, let's just talk real quick about Tenkara rods. Okay, so one thing that I'm sure that you know, even if you're new, is that on Tenkara rods, we don't use a reel. It's what's called fixed line fly fishing, and the line is attached to the tip of the rod. Typically, the grip is cork or foam, or in some cases, it's just the blank. Those are typically in rods intended for bait fishing and some very similar fixed line styles of fishing. Your Tenkara style rods are almost all going to have cork or foam grips. Typically, the rod's going to be 8 to 15 feet in length. 12 feet will suit just about our requirements and is probably the most common length being fished probably anywhere. Typically, these Tenkara rods are about 3 ounces or less and can collapse down to 20 inches or less in some cases. Has anybody not seen a Tenkara rod? I'll need someone to answer that, you know, like Long, to tell me if people are telling me that they haven't. Okay, thanks. So now that we've taken a look at that, just to reiterate what that Lillian part is up there is where we're going to attach the line in rigging. So I just want to identify that part because it's important up there on the tip and let you know we'll be coming back to it. So let's talk about why the rods are as long as they are. You know, it's easy, especially if you're coming from a Western fly fishing background, to look at these 10, 12, in some case 14-foot rods and and get kind of intimidated, because I know in the Western fly fishing world, 8 feet's pretty long, you know, at 10, you're getting really long. But there's a very, very good reason that goes into the heart of the Tenkara rod fishing style that justifies and supports the reason for using a long rod. And that is simply that you use the length of the rod to hold the line off the water. Now, you can maximize what I like to call a Tenkara advantage by fishing the longest rod that you can possibly get away with on the terrain that you fish. The primary reason for shorter rods is overhead restriction, not stream width or depth. So I see a lot of people who will be like, oh, I've got this really cool little creek nearby. It's only 2 or 3 feet wide. It's wide open. It's in a meadow and everything. I want to fish it. I need a short rod, right? Because it's a small creek. Well, normally, I would fish something like that with a 13 or 14 foot rod, so I can stand even further back from that water. As long as I don't have overhead restrictions keeping me from casting, I'm gonna push the rod that I choose to fish as long as possible to be able to maximize my ability to keep that line off the water, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later. But it's important that you understand that the length of the rod is used to hold the line off the water while fishing. That's the central concept behind the equipment design. Okay, so let's talk about rod flex. You know, I've been thinking about rod flex a lot, and for a long time I've been explaining to people that rod flex is a ratio that describes where the rod bends or flexes. But the more I think about that, I think it's a more accurate description of where and how the rod actually loads under pressure when you've got fish on the line. And so we're going to talk about 3 different rod flex ratios here that you'll see very, very commonly when looking at Tenkara rods. And that is a 5.5, a 6.4, and a 7.3. So we're going to talk about those individually. We're going to talk about the overall concept, and we're going to talk about what these different rod flex ratios characteristics are. So 5.5, we can think of this as actually almost a percentage, that basically a 5.5 loads the force of the fish into the middle of the rod, about 50% up the rod. A 5.5 action is softer and more flexible blank. It allows precise and subtle manipulation. Unfortunately, it's a little bit less definitive of a hook set, and that can be a little bit of a learning curve. It's got a very dynamic action that's ideal for smaller fish. For instance, I've been fishing a lot of 5.5 rods the last year or so, and if I'm going to be fishing for anything like if I'm on a creek where I don't think things top out over a foot, I definitely want a 5.5 because I want those smaller fish to be more dynamic. I want to feel them more on the rod, get more play, have to fight them a little harder, and that 5.5 action gives me that sort of experience. 6.4 loads about 60% up the length of the rod. This is a very general action ratio, and it offers a wide range of capability. It gives you a more definitive hook set in most cases, and it's a faster action that's ideal and applicable to many situations. So a 6.4 rod, I would say the 6.4 actions and actions that feel in that category are probably the most common actions you're going to find. This is a good time to say that within these categories, for example, 5.5 or 6.4 or 7.3, that there's going to be variations. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But these are general guidelines that you can think of in regards to these actions. A 7.3 is going to load higher up the rod. So basically, you can think that these equate to a slightly stiffer rod. And I used to really push that sort of angle on it, but the more I'm looking at it, it's really more about where it loads and not where it bends. And so you'll even get variances in stiffness and softness in within a 7.3 or within a 6.4, because it's not so much a matter of how stiff the rod is as a matter of where that rod bends and physically places the load of stress that it's under when it has a fish on the line. So to finish talking about 7.3 here, it offers an even more definitive hook set typically because you've got less flexibility. The fish is coming up against something stiffer and sets a little easier. much faster action, and it's really applicable in my opinion to larger payloads, heavier lines, streamers, poppers. A stiffer, or to me, more of a tip flex, which is a good way to describe a 7.3, offers some increased subsurface strike detection. So I would look to an action like this for something more like subsurface nymphing, or something that really requires me to be able to transfer motion quickly back down into that rod, which the stiffer rod will allow me to do. Now, here's the thing. There's absolutely no industry standard in Japan, in the Chinese factories, in the Vietnamese factories, in the American companies. There's no standard or metrics that clearly push a product into a 5.5, a 6.4, a 7.3. In fact, some rod makers don't even use these ratios. Tanuki, I believe, prefers to try to describe them, which I think is a perfectly reasonable way to do it. But these make for a just general guideline. There's no hard and fast to it. And honestly, because there's so much variation in between manufacturers and no industry standard, your best bet, if you're really shopping around for rods, is to try to get them into your hands. So that's another place where meeting people in the community comes in good, because eventually, when we're able to fish together again, you can borrow rods and swap out rods and see what actions and characteristics work best for you. So I really encourage you, in regards to this, to be aware of these flex ratios and be cognizant of them as you're fishing and testing these rods out. But don't get super hung up on them. If it feels right to you, fish it. No one's going to come along and tell you that you can't fish for trout with a like small brook trout with a 7.3, or no one's going to tell you that you can't fish for bass with a 5.5. Now, that being said, they have characteristics that don't lend themselves to doing that very well, but it all comes down to what feels right for you in your hands. So before we move forward, I know that was really kind of a big blow through here, and that was just very, very basic overview of rods. But does anybody have any specific rod related questions as parts of the rod, how the rod is intended to work, how the rod is built, anything rod related that we can address before we move forward? I mean, I can always get you on the back end too, but I see on questions and answers here, do zoom rods flex change with their different lengths? And the answer to that is absolutely. It's uncommon. It's very difficult, and I bet Luan can speak to this. It's not easy to make an adjustable rod that has the same personality at every position. It changes weight, it changes balance, and it does change the flex profile, so it will change the performance of your rod. Personally, I see the utility in flex rod, in zoom rods, and I know a lot of people really like them. Personally, I like a consistent level of performance in my rods, and so I typically fish single position rods and move my hand positions to get that adjustable thing, because I don't want it to change personality on me and just be completely off the balance that I'm used to fishing when I switch. That being said, zoom rods work great for a lot of people, and I have fished a lot of them. I designed one myself, so don't be hesitant to use them. Yeah, me personally, I'm not a big fan of that. I see a question here: do certain rod actions work better with certain size level lines? Yeah, and I would say that as you get into a softer action, you're able to work more effectively with lighter lines. And we can back up and let me address that and say that on a 5.5, I would pretty much personally only fish a level line. I might pop up to a furled line, but I don't personally fish those very often. But I would definitely not really, under any circumstances, choose a 5.5 action for, say, throwing floating line and poppers at bass. that just would be an inappropriate action. It would not give me what I want. Now, if I wanted to throw floating line and poppers at bass, I would probably pop up to a 7-3. If you see where I'm going with this, we're about to talk here in a moment. We'll talk a little bit about designing systems that work for you. You can match your equipment to the water that you're fishing. There's no reason, I understand a lot of people only have one rod, and there's nothing wrong with that. I've rolled that way for a long time myself. And most of your rods will address 90% of the fishing situations that you get into. But that being said, if you want to pop up into like kind of specialist or purist territory and try that out, you get into really matching up the tool that you're using and to a larger system of line and tippet and fly that is dialed into what you're doing specifically. And yeah, some actions are going to be better at other lines than others. If your line does not, if your rod does not show your action, it may not. The manufacturer may not be claiming it to be of a certain kind. If you tell us what it is, I can probably give you a general idea of what the general action classification of your rod is. Metal post tips. I have not seen any metal post tip Tenkara rods. I've seen metal post tip crappie poles and various other dunking tools, but I have not seen metal post tip Tenkara rods.